This is Lowell Thomas in New York.
And go, my fellow Americans!
I'm Chet Huntley, your host on... We have 73 television cameras on Mayday Girl.
President Nixon is actively participating.
One small step for man.
Good evening. The war in Vietnam was an experience Americans lived with, fought and died in, and struggled to understand for a generation. It was an extension of the Cold War, a test of wills played out on television under Presidents Eisenhower, Kennedy, Johnson, Nixon, and Ford. Still, when the end finally came on April 30th, 1975, 22 years ago tonight, it was a shock, a humiliation. America had lost a war, failed an ally, abandoned vast stores of equipment, and left hundreds of thousands of South Vietnamese refugees to fend for themselves as the last Americans scrambled to get out ahead of the advancing North Vietnamese. Most Americans had left Vietnam after the Paris Peace Accords of 1973. The South Vietnamese army held off the communists for a while, but in 1975 they advanced, and on April 30th their victory was complete as they barreled into Saigon and through the gates of the presidential palace itself.
It looks as though all the government Americans are gone, all the contract civilian workers gone, taken out by a fleet of 81 helicopters guarded by 800 Marines on the ground and American planes and gunships in the air. About 900 to 1,000 Americans were taken out in 13 hours. At the same time, approximately 5,500 South Vietnamese were taken out. NBC News correspondent Jim Laurie is one of the few Americans still left in Saigon. Here from Saigon Radio Hookup is Laurie's report on the surrender.
At approximately 10 in the morning, Saigon time, the acting president of South Vietnam, General Dinh Van Minh, took to the airwaves nationwide to announce an unconditional surrender to the Viet Cong. In the words of General Minh, we are here to hand over the power of government to you in order to avoid bloodshed. This apparently is an invitation now to the forces of the communists to enter the city from the outskirts and take over power. It is a unilateral ceasefire and an unconditional surrender, the first hope that we have now that the 30-year war in South Vietnam is at last over.
Good evening. The city of Saigon was renamed today. The victorious communists who forced the city's surrender said the capital of South Vietnam henceforth will be known as Ho Chi Minh City, after the leader of North Vietnam, now dead, who fought the Japanese and the French and the Americans and the South Vietnamese in fighting which began in the early 1940s. North Vietnamese and Viet Cong troops rolled into the city to the cheers of some Saigonese, but not to all. One South Vietnamese Army colonel committed suicide with his pistol in a downtown square. The Viet Cong headquarters was set up in the former presidential palace, and the former president, Dinh Van Minh, is in custody. The American embassy was sacked, burned, and looted. The communist forces, some of them riding in Russian-made tanks, some in captured American jeeps, rolled into Saigon about 3.5 hours after the end of the dramatic American evacuation of U.S. nationals and many South Vietnamese. There is one thing which sticks in the mind about the evacuation yesterday from Saigon. During that evacuation, as the air throbbed with the noise of American helicopters, a sizable number of South Vietnamese went to the roofs of buildings in Saigon where they waited for American helicopters to pick them up. Now, these people were not on any evacuation lists, but they waited on the roofs anyway because they hoped or believed that they'd be rescued. They weren't. What is troublesome is that they had that hope. And they had it because the United States had taught millions of South Vietnamese that if they got in trouble, the United States would come to their aid. In the end, of course, we couldn't help everyone there, but a lot of them thought we would. And so the memory of those people sitting on those rooftops, waiting for us to help them, sticks in the mind. And that memory is one of the costs of our involvement in Vietnam.
When we come back, exclusive NBC News footage of the fall of Saigon.
You're watching NBC.
American military and diplomatic personnel evacuated Saigon in late April 1975. But some American newsmen stayed behind for weeks after that, including NBC News correspondent Jim Laurie.
After numerous delays and false starts, the first of the journalists present for the fall of Saigon arrived in Vientiane, Laos, 25 days after the communist takeover. 84 in all, we were flown from Saigon aboard a North Vietnamese piloted Soviet plane. The fall of Saigon came less than 4 hours after the end of the American evacuation on April 30th. Even as the Americans left, the embassy was systematically looted, floor by floor. Then the U.S. consulate next to the embassy was set afire. The burning and the looting was the work in part of angry and bitter Vietnamese who felt betrayed by the Americans. Some had tried, but failed to leave Vietnam on the American evacuation. In addition to the Vietnamese who missed the evacuation, some Americans did too. Among them, Gerald Posner, who had come to Vietnam to rescue several Vietnamese children.
British correspondent.
Can you do me a favor?
But how come you missed the last chopper?
I was at these people's house. It was curfew. You understand?
Yeah.
No. I've got tickets for the 2 kids. I've got some, papers for these people.
They're Vietnamese.
While the American embassy burned, a combined force of North Vietnamese and Viet Cong troops entered the old South Vietnamese presidential palace just at noon on the 30th. Soviet-made tanks rumbled right up to the doors of the palace. The troops raised the flag of the National Liberation Front, and the new red and blue vied with the yellow and red flag of the old Saigon regime. Soldiers with B-40 rockets took up their posts in front of the old National Assembly building. The people greeted the forces, who they now refer to as Yai Phong, or liberators, first with apprehension and then with relief. The relief was that things returned to normal quickly, with no bloodshed. Only the most obvious symbols of the past in Saigon were destroyed. The policy of the new government in South Vietnam appears slow and cautious. Plans call for a gradual tightening of restrictions. For the moment, Saigon remains much as it was before April 30th. But nobody is sure just how long these conditions will last. This is Jim Laurie, NBC News.
Welcome back to Time and Again as we look back on the fall of Saigon, the end of the war in Vietnam, on April 30th, 1975, 22 years ago tonight. Americans evacuated Saigon just hours before the North Vietnamese rolled into town. But some exceptionally brave and dedicated reporters stayed behind. NBC's Jim Laurie got out in May with exclusive footage shot by NBC cameraman Neil Davis, who stayed behind. On May 26, 1975, NBC News aired a special report called Communist Saigon, with Laurie's reporting and Davis's footage.
At 12 noon on April 30th, a North Vietnamese tank broke the gate at the President's Palace in Saigon. A communist soldier ran the revolution's flag across the empty lawn. The shooting on this day the communists won was not in a battle, but a celebration. Saigon had already surrendered. It's been almost a month now since the communists won the war in Vietnam, and during that time they've allowed us only bits and pieces of information on what's been going on there since Saigon surrendered. But now we are beginning to know a little more, since last Saturday, 82 newsmen, foreigners in Vietnam, flew out with the stories and films that have been piling up there during the communist takeover. NBC's Jim Laurie was one of them, and he brought out with him the film that we are going to be seeing tonight. Jim is in Hong Kong with NBC's Jack Perkins, and they're going to take us through the events of that last month in Vietnam, beginning with the surrender.
That was April 30th, when the last American helicopter left just before 8 o'clock in the morning. It was waiting on the roof of the U.S. Embassy for the last Americans to get aboard. While downstairs, even as the Americans were leaving, the South Vietnamese were going through the embassy floor by floor, looting it completely. There were some military police there. That accounts for the firing that you heard, trying to stop it, but actually a very half-hearted attempt to stop the looting.
And they weren't shooting people.
They weren't shooting, just shooting into the air warning shots. And there was the last helicopter that left the embassy carrying the U.S. Marines, the Marines that had spent the night keeping the Vietnamese back. The Vietnamese finally got to the roof of the embassy.
To the helipad? And
to the helipad there.
Were they waiting for another helicopter to come? Or?
Although there was no hope, they were waiting for that last chopper which never came. They had to struggle up to the roof through a great cloud of tear gas, because before the U.S. Marines left, they threw tear gas canisters. Downstairs, South Vietnamese were asking us how we could help them.
United States Mission Saigon.
We think that the American has some methods or find many ways to save us from the communists. We don't want to stay here anyway.
But do you know that all the Americans are gone?
Yes, I know that, but I must come in case, just in case.
But there's no way, because all the helicopters are gone.
Can you help us?
There is no way I can help, because we are staying here. We are staying in Saigon.
So the Americans were gone, and the government of South Vietnam surrendered.
At 10 o'clock on the 30th, General Dung Van Minh, who had been president only 2 days, called on South Vietnamese troops to lay down their arms. Then he met with reporters inside the palace. He said that the Provisional Revolutionary Government forces would be there any moment. And so everyone just waited. 12 o'clock noon. The first soldier carrying the flag of the National Liberation Front.
Smashing through the fence, the gates, and then rolling onto the grounds of the Independence Palace.
Then they all burst into spontaneous firing. This was just jubilation, not directed at any particular result. In the air. There was no resistance from the palace guard. They were disarmed quietly and then lined up on the grass, their weapons taken away.
Well, if the North Vietnamese troops were given to celebration, I guess from their point of view, it was quite something to celebrate. It was an awfully long way and long time from the jungles to this place, and at this time.
After all, this is what it was all about. Saigon, finally getting to Saigon after this 30 years of war.
Was there a lot of killing?
There was very little that we were able to determine. In Saigon, we did come across one apparently shot Arvin sailor, whose body was along the side of the road. The only one that we were able to see. There was a good bit of destruction. Some planes had crashed into certain sections of the city. I understand that some of these planes are piloted by people that were trying to make an escape from South Vietnam.
We continue now with the NBC News special Communist Saigon, which aired on May 26, 1975. It includes exclusive footage just brought out of the country by correspondent Jim Laurie, who describes what happened in Saigon after it became Ho Chi Minh City.
And immediately, the enterprising tailors of the city,
new business,
started making Viet Cong flags, which were immediately put up on all the buildings.
They must have been, someone must have been making them long before.
Probably so, in little tailor shops
away in
the Chinese sector. And another innovative vendor started creating what came to be known throughout the war as Ho Chi Minh sandals, the footwear of the guerrilla.
Carved out of the treads of old rubber tires.
Probably off of American vehicles. Immediately, all of the South Vietnamese regulars, the soldiers, were asked to register. In a few days, there were radio broadcasts asking all citizens to bring their old papers of the old government down and register themselves.
Well, do you know of any reprisals against men because they served in the Arvin, because they were South Vietnamese soldiers?
Even the South Vietnamese officers went to register and were given new papers, returned home, and told, go about your business as usual. This monument in downtown Saigon symbolized the South Vietnamese army. And in a few days, students and others decided to take the statue down.
It's also symbolized what an excess of money and bad taste can accomplish. Who brought it down?
It was brought down by students and other civilians.
on the theory that the symbols must go.
The symbols of the past must go. And there it went.
That's time and again for now. Thanks for joining us. I'm Jane Pauley, and we're History.